So as I was joking in the announcements, we're going to talk about the ultimate reality that we call God in 45 minutes or so. We'll see how we do, but I need your help, so stay with me. So as Charles said, we've kind of done a view from 3,000 feet of the history of Christianity, and specifically the roots of our tradition that have brought us to be inheritors of progressive Christianity. So the conversation around God could start in any number of ways, but I'm going to kind of zoom in from where we find ourselves in a contemporary context around the language of God, here specifically in an American context. Then we're going to talk a little bit about God language. So what do we mean when we say the word God? What is the referent of the word God doing? What do we want to claim and proclaim when we use God language? And I'm hoping to open it up so that it'll be less of a lecture and have some more sharing, because a lot of you, and I've heard some of your journeys and stories have worked hard and worked spiritually to claim and understand your relationship and understanding of God. So I'd love to hear who God and what God is for you. And just so you know, so this central image here is a Trinitarian image. It's a symbol for the Trinity. So these next 3 weeks are of a piece. So we're starting with God, and then next week Rachel will look at Jesus, and then Jeffrey, I believe, will be looking at the Holy Spirit. So as a good Trinitarian, all 3 weeks need each other to understand the mystery that is God in our tradition. So who or what is God? Some believe that God language was on its way out, and that God language might no longer feel relevant for folks, but actually, the big polls like Gallup and Pew have consistently reported for about 50 years or so that between 90 and 95% of Americans still say they believe in God, whatever God means to them. That's another question. Here's the most recent that I could find from Pew Research. So this was from 2014. I just thought this was kind of interesting as we're talking about what we're talking about when we talk about God. The percent of American adults who say that they believe in God absolutely certain, interesting choice of language, to fairly certain, not to / at all certain, believe in God but don't know, which would be kind of like agnosticism, do not believe in God, and other / don't know believe in God. So as you can see by all the qualifiers on those categories, when we talk about God, language gets slippery. And even though on a graph they look like clean, distinct categories, if you wake up on a Tuesday, you may find yourself in a different category. But I think it's still interesting that just the way that God language continues to be very relevant and resonant in people's lives. So, images of God. Here's just a smattering, right? We have the famous creation of Adam by Michelangelo from 1512. Adam and this image of God reaching out, humanity and divinity almost touching. Down in the bottom right corner is a popular content of New Yorker cartoons, which is the old white bearded dude in a throne. I particularly like this one because the throne kind of looks like an armchair, and he's self-referentially wearing a t-shirt that says OMG, or oh my God. He looks kind of perturbed. So our images of God, a lot of people talk about the classical, although it's not particularly biblical, idea of a God with a beard, an old white guy in the sky. We're going to bust open some of the images today, but I thought I would just kind of, as a way of starting a little smattering of alternative imagery for God in the progressive Christian landscape. We have the double helix nebula, I believe it's called, from the Hubble telescope on the top right. Sometimes that image is called the Eye of God, one of my favorite Hubble images. And then I just threw up there, to counter the white men with beards image, a t-shirt I've been seeing among clergy colleagues and activists. I met God, she's black, which is a fun and kind of conversation starter t-shirt to wear at a church gathering. Obviously, it's messing with the millennia of imagery around God that has associated God with a certain race and gender. And then here in the center, oh yeah, I could have imaged through here. Then here in the center is something from the UCC's most recent Still Speaking campaign called Go Ahead, Open the God Box. So I thought that was kind of fitting for what we're going to do today. Open up the box that is God language and see what we find. Richard Rohr, who's a Catholic priest and a progressive Christian writer, and this has been attributed to others, William Sloane Coffin among others. He says that he often, people come up to him when he's teaching classes or at talks and say, I appreciate that all you say, but when you use God language, I really just can't relate because you see, I don't believe in God. And then his response, Richard Rohr says, is always, tell me about the God you don't believe in. And they do. And very often, that God is something like the white man in the sky with a beard. And very often, that kind of conversation, they may come to a point where he says, oh, I don't believe in that God either. And then a different, deeper kind of conversation might take place. So I offer you that in your back pocket around some of these just really intractable debates around the existence of God. If you're facing that chasm of language, tell me about the God you don't believe in is a great invitational response. So names for God. I thought I would open up so it can be more of a conversational piece. Favorite names for God in your own prayer life, or names you grew up hearing God. And we could talk about tradition. I know we're coming off of a few weeks of biblical interpretation that Jeffrey was setting up. So just throw out anyone at all. Names for God. Father. Jehovah, Mother, Yahweh. Say that again. Spirit. Mm-hmm. Love. Say that one more time. I am. Yeah, beautiful. I'm going to get to that one. Ground of being. Yes, Paul Tillich's. Yahweh. Beautiful. Okay, we'll have more, but let's go with Yahweh for a little bit. Oh, so here's a nice wordle of smattering from our tradition. There's some patriarchal language scattered in there, but here we go. So Yahweh, Yahweh is the sort of the most central foundational name for God in the Hebrew Bible, consisting of 4 letters, which is commonly transliterated or sort of like transposed into the Latin letters of YHWH, which we often pronounce as Yahweh. Now, the name for God, Yahweh, is actually not so much a noun as a verb, derived from a verb that means to be, to exist, to cause to become, or to come to pass. So the story of the burning bush. Does anyone want to remind us of the story of the burning bush? Quick Cliff Notes version.
Well, Moses on the field and she's in the bush, and I think associates it with the idea of God.
Yep, so Moses running, sees this burning bush, associates it, and hears a voice out of the bush saying, I am that I am, or I am who I am. And he says, who's going to believe me? What should I say I experienced here? And he says, say that I am sent you. So this is the name Yahweh. I am who I am. And this is an image here of the 4 letters, Yahweh, in Hebrew. Also, the verb for God is less of a solid, concrete noun that you can pin down. If you think about just this foundational name for God is actually a verb. It's a dynamic identity that is literally in motion. Because I don't know Hebrew, but I know that tenses work differently in Hebrew. So even the word I am is sometimes translated as I will be who I will be. Here's a nice image of that burning bush. I am that I am, or that who I am. Zooming back out to the conversation of what we talk about when we talk about God, I'll give a little more context to facilitate conversation. So what is the referent to that word? What are we talking about when we talk about God? This image comes from the title of a book by the progressive Christian pastor Rob Bell. Perhaps we're talking about the more. Is there a more? William James is, who's the author of The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is an early 20th century text. His generic term for God or the sacred is the more. So that the idea that in addition to this visible world of our ordinary experience, there is a more, a non-material layer or level of reality, an extra dimension of reality. And I also just want to cite that I'm going to be working pretty closely from some of the big picture work that Marcus Borg does in his book, The Heart of Christianity, which I commend to you. He starts with faith, the Bible, and then he moves into a chapter called God, the Heart of Reality, and does some of this big picture. So I'm working from some of his work. This is from Borg. Being Christian means affirming the reality of God. God is real. There is a more. The Bible and all the enduring religions of the world unambiguously affirm that there is a stupendous, magnificent, wondrous more. So even this language is finding ways to kind of crack open some of the, I think, the ways that our intellect and our hearts harden around language and images that are really ingrained into our consciousness. Here's another definition of that same mysterious more. This is from the French mystic Simone Weil, also a 20th century figure. She says, there is a reality outside the world. That is to say, outside space and time, outside humanity's mental universe, outside any sphere whatsoever that is accessible to human faculties. And corresponding to this reality, at the center of the human heart, is the longing for an absolute good, a longing which is always there and is never appeased by any object in this world. And it's a lot to take in audibly. But central in a lot of these definitions of God are not only the transcendent nature of the absolute, but also a sense of how do we experience God, a sense of the intimate experience of that God inside the human heart. And we're going to talk about that tension as the transcendence of God and the immanence of God, which in theology there's a lot of tensions and balancing acts. That how can God both be transcendent, greater than this world, and yet immanent, present, right here with us in this world? So we'll get to that tension in a little bit. But also in Simone Weil's definition, she got at this longing, this presence of a longing for good in the human heart as pointing towards the presence of God. So I just want to lift that up. St. Augustine, about 1600 years ago, wrote that our hearts are restless until they find their home in God, until they rest in God. And so when we talk about what we talk about when we talk about God is also human yearning, longing for good, and the restlessness that is sort of deepest at our heart. Okay. I'm going to throw out a couple other names for God, so kind of stream of consciousness style, so let them wash over you, and if you feel like responding or offering others. The ground of being was already lifted up from the theologian Paul Tillich, and here's a description of Tillich. Tillich's theology here. If, when you think of the word God, you are thinking of a reality that may or may not exist, then you are not thinking of God. And Tillich's point here is that the word God itself, for him, it doesn't actually refer to a particular existing thing that may or may not be real, a thing, and that's the God of supernatural theism that we'll get to in just a moment, but rather that the word God is just our best take on, our best common Western name for what is, or ultimate reality, being itself, isness, I am that I am. And Tillich's favorite phrase that he popularized, which was the ground of being itself, which is quite a different rendering of God as the ground of being versus a transcendent outside of being. Thomas Keating, who was a contemporary teacher of contemplative prayer, founder of centering prayer here in the States, calls God isness without limitation. Getting pretty philosophical here, so stay with me. 12-step programs, AA and others, talk of a higher power. Higher power, sometimes called God, or God, the God of our understanding is language that 12-step programs, addiction programs use. So that works for some people, others not. The theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher talked about the relationship of God as the feeling of absolute dependence that human beings have, of absolute dependence on something else that is not us. We already heard creator, parent imagery like father, mother, and the Trinity, which is grounding our conversation. Here's one for any philosophy fans in the house, the unmoved mover. Is anyone familiar with that concept? So popularized by Aristotle, philosophy, a sense of, in the movement of the universe, of all things, that sort of looking at creation, that at the back of experience of creation of the world, there is an ultimate causer of all this action, an unmoved mover. And this is language that St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, was a Dominican friar and theologian, really grabbed onto and picked up on this language of unmoved mover in his attempt to prove God's existence. Okay, a few more. And again, just let these wash over you. And I encourage, if something speaks to you, I'm going to open it up to hear your responses. Here's from Rob Bell, his book, What We Talk About When We Talk About God. When I'm talking about God, he writes, I'm talking about a reality, known, felt, and experienced, but one that cannot be located in any specific physical space in any tangible way. A reality known, felt, and experienced, a reality, but one that cannot be located in any specific physical space in any tangible way. So, as this language watches over you, it's complicated. It brings us to the very limits of language itself as we attempt to name that which is beyond names, the ineffable. And to reach across traditions, the opening, I love the opening line of the Tao Te Ching. So in Taoism, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. So again, this sense of if, back to Tillich, if when you think of the word God, you are thinking of a reality that may or may not exist, then you're not thinking of God. Belden Lane, who's a contemporary Christian theologian, said something similar. He says, we must speak, yet we cannot speak without stammering. Language about God stalks the borderland of the limits of language, using speech to confound speech, speaking in riddles, calling us to humble silence in the presence of mystery. So when we talk about God, we are brought to the very limits of language. Okay, I'm going to get a little more concrete here because it's hard to talk about God, if you didn't notice. Even when it's your job. Maybe especially so. So we were talking a little bit about the more, right? That's where we started. A non-religious worldview would say that there is no more. There is only this sort of space-time world of matter and energy that's connected with the Enlightenment in the 17th century, sometimes called the modern worldview. So again, I'm working from Borg here. Some people simply add an idea of God to that modern worldview. God is the one who created everything we can see. This is a sense of God is out there and separate from the world. Now, in progressive Christianity, we are inheritors, and this is, anytime you're making generalizations, of course, you're speaking in general terms, but we are inheritors of more or less, and there are others, but we're going to talk about two concepts of God. Theism, or supernatural theism, and then we're going to talk about panentheism, not to be confused with pantheism. So we're going to break this down a little bit. And Karen Armstrong is another name you might be familiar with. She talks about these two concepts of God in her A History of God, which is also excellent, from the 90s. And these two ancient concepts of God really run side by side throughout the history of Abrahamic religions, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And both are found in our biblical tradition. So we are inheritors of both. So supernatural theism, the one on the left here, is the one I think most people think of when they think of the Abrahamic religions, monotheistic religion. God as a person-like being, so as a being, like a person, although a superlative person, a supreme being, not quite a person like we are, but a sense of God as being out there, our Father who art in heaven. And then with this comes a sense of God as interventionist. So God intervenes, God who is separate from the world, intervenes in the world through spectacular events, and continues to intervene from an outside-in way in our own lives and in our own midst. And there's nuances around this. You can have a lot of mystery around that. But so in broad terms, we're looking at supernatural theism as God above and separate from the universe. Now I want to talk about panentheism, which you see in this little diagram. We have the universe as being contained within what we're calling God. God as the encompassing spirit in whom everything that is exists. So the universe here is not separate from God, but actually in God. So even the word panentheism, which I think is only like a couple hundred years old, but the concept goes back further. Pan means, any word geeks out there? All, everything, yeah. Pan means in, and then theism obviously is from the Greek word for God, theos. So this is not to be confused with pantheism, which is a doctrine that says that God and the universe are the same thing, are identical. And the universe is the manifestation of God. And some would say that pantheism reduces God to the universe, to what you can see. Panentheism, on the other hand, is bridging that divide that we were touching on earlier of transcendence and immanence. That God is somehow both up there or out there, beyond reality, and also everywhere, omnipresent. So those words, transcendence and immanence, another kind of easier to put in your pocket language for that might be the moreness of God and the presence of God. So transcendence is like the moreness, that God is more than what we see and can taste and experience with our senses. And then the presence is the God that we can see and experience and feel with our senses.
So is that anything like another dimension?
Say more about that.
How can it be more than the whole universe? The universe is a four-dimensional space.
Mm-hmm.
So how can it be more than that unless there's another dimension that God is looking down on us as the four-dimensional space? Like the book
Cool.
Flatland, I don't know if you ever read that.
Which book?
Flatland.
Oh,
It's about a two-dimensional space.
Huh.
Everything's just on a tabletop. Creatures moving around people. And then there's a third-dimensional being looking down on them. So that's kind of a...
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, some people looking at modern cosmological science talk about that which is outside of space-time, but I like the language of a different dimension. Yeah.
This is a little out there, I'll admit, but about 40 years ago, they first started talking about string theory. And now some people say it's 10 measures, some point to it, and never really heard it, but the essence of it is that the very essence is not the electron and a quark, but a piece of vibrating string, which is pure energy. And I have always, for the last 4 years, that fit in my model through reading William James and Paul Tillich. That fit my model with that little piece of vibrating energy, which defines all of reality, is, in my mind, God. And it's energy. And the other thing, if you look at string theory, if you look at the relationship between space and time, at that point where God is, he, she, can be all-knowing in one sense, but we can still have free will. Because at that point, time is set at point in the realm of pure energy. So that explains that. But can we prove string theory? No, we don't have the...
That's why they call it a theory. Yeah.
But it fits.
Yeah. Beautiful testimony. Thank you. Anyone else want to respond about string theory, cosmology? Okay. We'll keep going. So here, this is here's the image that we were just talking about, supernatural theism versus panentheism. And I just want to lift up the biblical, that I said both are inherited parts of our tradition. So it's not just that supernatural theism is it, and panentheism is this thing we've created to make it more palatable to modern day worldviews. But actually that both are, it's a twin tradition that we receive through our biblical and church history. So here's this great quote from Paul in the book of Acts, that God is the one in whom we live, and talking about Jesus, the one in whom we live and move and have our being, which is a very resonant with the panentheistic model. and just an image of fish swimming in water to offer you. Sometimes, it's hard to talk about God. Sometimes we need metaphor and images and poetry. Do better theology sometimes, I think, than theologians. So the image of fish in water might stay with you more than a diagram, to think about God being in the universe the way fish are in water.
So for the fish, the ground being is the water.
Yes, you could interpret it in that way. That we are in God. And here was a description I liked about the fish in water. That the fish are in water, so we are in God. There's also water in the fish, but the more dominant reality is that the fish are in the water. Think about that one. Okay, I'm just going to not bother with this. When we talk about, we'll get there. Okay. We're talking about transcendence and immanence. We get also to the question of revelation. So if God is beyond all things, beyond all names, and yet we say Emmanuel, right? Our understanding of Jesus, which Rachel will get to next week, but God is with us. How do we, we're doing theology when you ask questions like, how do we know anything about God anyway? And I offer you from John Calvin, since one of the last times I was here, we talked about John Calvin. One of my favorite passages from John Calvin, in which he talks about God using basically baby talk to communicate with us. He says God lisps to us. So here's from the Institutes by Calvin. See, that those who anthropomorphize God, who dream of a bodily God, because they talk about God's mouth and ears and eyes and hands and feet, as often are ascribed to him in Scripture, those are easily refuted, Calvin writes. For who is so devoid of intellect as not to understand that God, in so speaking, when we read in the Bible that God, like we talk about God's hands, even that image of God having hands is God lisping to us, with us, as nurses who are wont to do with little children. Such modes of expression, therefore, do not so much express what kind of a being God is, as accommodate the knowledge of God to our feebleness. And in doing so, he must stoop far below God's proper height. So I find this just really beautiful image of the immensity and the hard to grasp immateriality of God, and yet these descriptions of God as having hands or mouth that are person-like are not literal descriptions, but rather God using our language, like baby talk, to accommodate, to come down to us and speak to us. Okay. I want to leave time for conversation, so I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. So when we talk about God, we started off with, so what is God language? What is the referent when we use the word God? And then the next question, I think, and then Borg goes here, is, so what is God like, this God that we're describing? What is the nature of God, the characteristics of God? What does God want? What does God love? What is God passionate about? What is God like? Which, could be as easy as searching our tradition about what is God like, but you'd get a lot of responses, like, the Lord is near, but also far away, or the Lord is a speaking God, or we in the UCC like to say a still speaking God. In our tradition, you would also get some results like the Lord, our God, is a jealous God, and also a merciful God, and that the Lord, our God, alone is God. These are just a few about what God is like. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to offer you a little description about grappling with our images of God and the character of God from Richard Rohr. So Richard Rohr writes that if we want to go to a deeper understanding, a more mature, and this is the non-dual multiple levels of spirituality. So we were talking about the dualism of the supernatural theism, world and God. Rohr writes that we have to deal with the faulty, inadequate, and even the toxic images of God that get in the way of people having an authentic God experience. So, for instance, here we go. The wrathful, angry God, or the Santa Claus God, right? Doling out blessing. And we need to grapple with those images that get in the way of our experience of God, because those are still the God that a lot of people are praying to. But there's not. They are, and Rohr calls them the unworkable basis for a real spirituality. Rather, talking about God in Trinity and in Jesus as the image of the invisible God reveals a different kind of God, and Rohr calls it the divine flow, under, around, and through all things. Think again of the fish in water. Much more a verb than a noun. Remember we talked about Yahweh, the verb. Relationship itself, rather than an old man sitting on a throne like in the New Yorker cartoon. And Jesus, who you'll talk more about next week, tells us who God is, the very heart of God. That God is like a loving parent who runs towards us, claps and kisses us while we are still a long way off. And unless this experience of God is experienced, then most of Christianity itself doesn't work if we're caught in those gatekeeper images of God. Okay. We're running out of time, so I'm going to just put that unfinished conversation, which, couldn't happen in 45 minutes, and open it up to your own relationship with God, your own understanding of God today, Memorial Day weekend 2016. There's a Greek author who wrote a book on St. Francis, and he wrote, "What is God but the search for God?" So encouraging you to feel the longing and the restlessness and the unfinishedness in not finding a definition of God, and yet finding ways to talk about God when someone says, "So you go to church? You believe in God? What's that about?" To have the strength of the complexity of the tradition, but also the courage of your conviction to put language around the ineffable, to dare to do so. So maybe we have a few minutes. Maybe if you're feeling like some solo time, I encourage you to take a little reflection time, or maybe turn to a neighbor or two and just share a little bit about where you are today with your own experience of God language. And then we'll come back together in 5 minutes and close. Experiences or testimonies of God that anyone wants to lift up, or something someone else said that you really appreciated? Sure.
As you talked about God as a pure relationship.
Sure.
And I wonder that we are dependent on God, but in some ways God is dependent on us. I mean, a parent, it requires a child to be a parent. In a sense, more, the fish, you can have water on the fish, but I think in a sense of God, and there's also this, that God also seems to involve with humanity.
Interesting. Yeah, I appreciate it. I think there's a complexity in our tradition, because there would be some line of Christian thought that would, or orthodoxy, doctrine, that would say that God doesn't need us. And yet, somehow, God can't do it alone, right? There's this, and there's contradictions everywhere, but there is a sense that God is beyond us and much more powerful than us and doesn't actually need us. And yet, turns out God uses us fully through.
Well, so that we are God's fingers and feet and voice.
Right. Who was it that said, Christ has no hands in the world but yours? No, yeah. Was it Teresa of Avila? No.
Francis of Assisi.
I think it was, yeah. To Google later. Anything else emerge? Questions or wonderings?
There's a whole tradition that God loves us, in addition,
Yes.
that wants relationship with us.
Yes, the relationship. Mm-hmm.
And so that's more than just
Yeah, no, I appreciate that activity too that you're centering, because a lot of Christian conversation, relationship, a lot of theology, like Karl Barth, for instance, would say that, who's a big Protestant theologian, 20th century, would say that God's isness, we can only describe God by God's actions. So the best way to talk about God in the world is to talk about verbs, the narrative, so like love and what's God's desire for us. Yeah.
I equate God with creativity, that because He loves us, He creates us. And as parents, when we love one another, we create children. And if you are a creative person, the creativity that comes from you through your music, the form of your art, is something that flows from love.
From an excess of experience. Yeah, one little cool factoid that my poet husband and I were talking about recently was that apparently the word creativity, as to talk about human beings, is relatively new, like just a couple hundred years old, of a usage of the word creativity, because previously it was used to describe God, the creator, ultimate creative artist, which I just thought was kind of interesting. Anything? Yeah, Marianne.
Well, Joelle shared an image that really spoke to me, talking about a tunnel, and she's at one end and God is at the other. It's not that she, creator, is unattainable. That she was saying that there are echoes. Well, Jeffrey, I think, in several of his presentations and Bible study, talks about the conversation. And so I love that. Not that it's unattainable.
Right.
And there are ripples of communication back and forth.
Beautiful. It also gets at the longing and the restlessness too. Yeah.
Building on that a little bit, but in this context of the ineffable, that God is there is one thing. That we are open to God takes work. And that is the message that how we understand God, whatever degree of teensy bit of understanding we can achieve,
Sure.
is something that comes out of not a passive, although it can be passive, but mostly it takes exercising that muscle to be in relationship, to be open to the tunnel, or other means of communication.
I know we're going to talk about prayer and spiritual practices in the last couple classes of this. Yeah. Stan.
Reminds me, one understanding that I have is that up until recent years, I'll say the last 50 years or so, we in the West have been in the minority in the world in that, we have a physical understanding that the physical is the primary reality, whereas in most of the rest of the world, what they see.
Immaterial,
So, you
yeah.
know, wedding celebrations and funeral celebrations that take place over 3 days, you know.
Sure.
This whole celebration of the other is, so they didn't work, evidently, you know. They didn't have to do the work that we perceive that we have to do in order to relate to God, because their reality was other anyway. And that gradually, you know, it appears that most of the rest of the world is coming around to the Western view of, you know, everything that's real is what we see. And, you know, we can measure all that stuff.
The anthropologist in me is also noticing, like, the separation of the sacred and the mundane that we kind of often see as the sacred is separate, whereas you're describing societies in which sort of the sacred is kind of written into the daily life. Yeah. Yeah, Tom.
Thinking about a pantheistic conception of God. I heard Matthew Fox, the writer, speak when I was in college. And,
local radical priest in Oakland, yeah.
And he said, what's God doing? God is on the birthing table giving birth to the universe.
Great image, which is messy and full of pain and creativity. Yeah.
So you know the saying that, like, if the God you believe in seems to agree with you on everything, it's probably not God. I was kind of wondering, like, if God, like, molds herself to, like, fit what you need at a certain moment, is that also not God? Like,
Right. If God accommodates, like, molds so that we can perceive God and what we need, speaks to us in our language. But then, yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, I don't know if it, like, makes sense, and I was going to say something else, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Yeah, Carolyn.
Well, Rowan's question reminds me of, like, a metaphor that helps me understand God. It's like a special education teacher who, like, scaffolds our understanding of God and life and relationship for whatever we're ready for then, because we all have all these abilities and disabilities and limitations. And so, yeah, God might be what we need, but God's also so much more than that. That God's, like, slowly growing us too as we jump over hurdle after hurdle.
And it's not, like, comprehensive of God, but it's the limits of our understanding.
Yeah. When people talk about, like, God loving us, but sometimes I think, well, to me it's more like God, like, knowing us through and through, like, before we know ourselves. Like, that knowledge is, like, necessary before, like, any kind of love, like love of others. So I don't know. I don't know.
I love that. And that kind of knowledge is exactly what, and it's just about time, so feel free, but I'm just going to wrap up. So that kind of knowledge is what the word revelation means, so the knowledge of God. And one kind of central tenet in Christian theology is that we don't know things about God, but we know God as you would encounter, and again, this is person language, but a presence or a person. Yeah, okay. Time. Outside of space-time, we would continue talking about God ad infinitum, but unfortunately we live in space-time. So, but yeah, I hope to continue some of these conversations with you all in one form or another. And I'm going to close us with a quote from Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, who says, "What is called knowledge in everyday parlance is only a small island in a vast sea that has not been traveled. Hence, the existential question for the knower is this: which does the knower love more? The small island of their so-called knowledge, or the sea of infinite mystery? So let us shove off into the sea of infinite mystery and have a lovely weekend.